The Great Reunion. The last battle of the American Civil War was fought near Brownsville, Texas on May 12, 1865, and on June 19th, the Union forces of General Gordon Granger arrived in Galveston, Texas to enforce the Emancipation Proclamation, bringing an end to slavery in the former Confederacy. After 4 years and more than 600,000 military deaths, the American Civil War was over. The Union was preserved, and slavery in the United States came to an end, though the nation's struggle towards its ideals of freedom and equality for all would continue. For the hundreds of thousands of Union soldiers who fought in the war and survived, they became part of a unique brotherhood. Though the mental and physical scars they endured would always be with them, they quickly discovered that the nation they had fought to preserve desired to move on from the bloody conflict. Most civilians wanted to put the war behind them, but for veterans, that was impossible. They began organizations for mutual support. The most famous of these was the Grand Army of the Republic, a national organization of Union veterans, but smaller local groups, such as Licking County's Society of Soldiers and Sailors, coalesced as well. The veterans gathered to decorate graves and memorialize as a group, calling upon their fellow citizens to not forget as well. Yet they desired a grander event that would remember the days when they marched in their thousands. The veterans of Licking County, therefore, planned a great reunion of Ohio War veterans in 1878. Ohio, and Licking County in particular, had sent a large number of volunteers to fight to end slavery and preserve the Union. As historian Larry Stevens explains,
Licking County had no problem supplying soldiers for the American Civil War. Local companies of men from Licking County served in 17 regiments. The largest contingent of soldiers from Licking County was the 76th Ohio Volunteer Infantry, with field and staff and 7 of the 10 companies serving from the area. It was recruited and organized in the fall of 1861 at the Great Circle Mound in Newark, Ohio. Led by Colonel Charles R. Woods and his brother Lieutenant Colonel William B. Woods, the regiment was introduced to battle at Fort Donelson, Tennessee in February of 1862. They participated that year in the Battle of Shiloh, various raids along the Mississippi River, and Sherman's first attack on Vicksburg at the Battle of Chickasaw Bayou. 1863 found them at the Battle of Arkansas Post and fighting with Ulysses S. Grant in his brilliant Vicksburg campaign. Later in the year, the regiment moved to the Chattanooga area and fought in the critical battles of Lookout Mountain, Mission Ridge, and Ringgold Gap. After a well-deserved furlough early in 1864, the unit returned and participated in most of the battles of William T. Sherman's Great Atlanta Campaign. They then served on Sherman's March to the Sea in the fall of 1864. 1865 found them with Sherman advancing north through the Carolinas. They were present at Bennett's house at Durham, North Carolina for the surrender of the Confederate armies of the West. After marching through Richmond, they arrived in Washington, D.C., where they participated in the grand review of the victorious Federal armies. Soon after, they were moved to Louisville, Kentucky, and discharged on July 24, 1865. Overall, during the war, 1,500 men served in the 76th Ohio Volunteer Infantry, with approximately 1,100 from Licking County. 351 died in battle or in hospitals, and another 241 were wounded. The Civil War soldiers' service was severe. They were exposed to nature's elements throughout the war, with cold and heat taking out many men. Living in the camps was dangerous, as they were exposed to disease and poor food. Becoming proficient at marching was important, as most of the time they were moving on foot. Bodies wore out just keeping up with the regiment. The easy times came when they were packed into railroad cars or steamboats for longer travels. The soldier's life was dangerous. Battle casualties and deaths were in high numbers. The science of the time knew how to efficiently kill and maim with new weapons and tactics. The surgeons of the time did the best they could to save the wounded soldiers, but the science of the time knew nothing of sanitary precautions. Many died from minor wounds, and others survived with horrible amputations. The government and people of the United States owed these volunteer soldiers respect and care for the hard service that they endured throughout the American Civil War.
While some soldiers never returned from the war, most did. They returned to their lives, but their shared experiences led them to reunite from time to time to honor those that had died. Thus did 53 veterans of the 76th Ohio Volunteer Infantry find themselves at a regimental reunion on September 13, 1877. They assembled at the Old Fort, as they called the Great Circle earthworks just southwest of Newark. This is where they had first gathered to drill as a regiment in 1861 before marching off to war. On that day in September 1877, the drum corps played, speeches were given, and they relaxed in their camaraderie. Such were the positive feelings of the event that they decided that they should do it again the next year. So, in proper military fashion, they established a chain of command and began to plan for 1878. Joseph Worley, lieutenant colonel and budding manufacturer, would take charge as the organization's president. When the Civil War broke out, Worley, a German immigrant to the U.S. and owner of a grocery store, recruited and organized Company E of the 76th at his own expense, serving as the company captain. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Kibler, Major Charles Dana Miller, and Captain John Rees were among the other leading figures in the organization. General Charles Woods, brother of future Supreme Court Justice William Woods, was also a member. They called themselves the Society of the Soldiers and Sailors of Licking County, Ohio. The society met as a group several times in November 1877 at the restaurant and parlor of John Coos in Newark. In their adopted constitution, they declared their goal to be to perpetuate the memories of the service and cherish its friendships by annual meetings or celebration. They also decided that the society could expand whom it invited to celebrations to include veterans beyond Licking County. From the earliest days of the society, there were plans for a grand gathering, far beyond the few dozen members of the 76th Ohio. First and foremost, they needed a site that could accommodate thousands. Luckily, the citizens of Licking County had a location near Newark that had been a large gathering place long before the arrival of European settlers to North America. The Old Fort, as it was called by 19th century inhabitants of Newark, and better known to us today as the Great Circle earthworks, was constructed by the Hopewell people between 100 BC and 500 AD. Encompassing 30 acres of land with the Eagle Mound near its center, the Great Circle was one of the grandest surviving structures of the constellation of native earthworks that marked prehistoric Licking County. Many of the smaller embankments and earthworks had been destroyed by human activity since the founding of Newark in 1802. However, the people of Newark understood something of the ancient significance of the larger sites, like the Great Circle, and took steps to ensure their survival. The earthworks came into the possession of the Licking County Agricultural Society and were used for a variety of civic purposes, such as the Ohio State Fair in 1854 and the drilling of the 76th at the start of the Civil War. Though 19th century Licking Countians had varying theories about how the ancient Hopewell utilized the site, they understood the majesty in the work they had left behind, and came together as a community to preserve its most vital pieces. The earthworks became a point of pride for locals, and one envied by their neighbors. In its praise of the reunion, the Mount Vernon Republican noted that Newark has the finest natural park in central Ohio. It has historical interest as well as natural beauty. The Old Fort was the logical place to hold the reunion, and, given the large influx of people expected, one of the few places that could accommodate so many. On January 23rd, the society met again and approved of having a general soldiers' reunion to be held at the Old Fort. They chose July 22nd as their date, not the growing day of celebration for veterans that was Decoration Day on May 30th. The society would have a separate event on May 30th, a holiday which would eventually become enshrined in our calendars as Memorial Day. The society chose instead the date of July 22nd to honor the death of a particular Union soldier, General James McPherson. McPherson was born in Clyde, Ohio, and was a graduate of West Point Military Academy in 1853. He had a talent for engineering and administration and rose quickly to the rank of Major General and served as a field commander. McPherson would have one of the primary commands under General William Tecumseh Sherman for his Atlanta campaign. On July 22, 1864, While riding between units of his army on the first day of the Battle of Atlanta, McPherson was surprised by Confederate soldiers. The general attempted to evade capture and was shot and killed. He was the second highest ranking Union soldier to die in the war. McPherson was well loved by his comrades, and his name was memorialized after his death in Fort McPherson near Atlanta, McPherson Square in Washington, D.C., as well as schools, highways, and counties across the country. To the men of the Society of Soldiers and Sailors, many of whom had served with Sherman in Georgia, McPherson was a fallen hero and a deserving honoree for the reunion. The Society appointed committees to oversee each aspect of the reunion: reception, finance, correspondence, general arrangements, and a banquet committee. Each day of the week, save Sunday, there was a Society committee meeting, including a joint meeting of all committees on Fridays. What they had in mind would take serious planning. They desired to hold a reunion for all of Ohio's Civil War veterans, and needed to notify and keep them informed of the plans, feed them, direct them from Newark to the Great Circle and back, and properly celebrate the veterans with corresponding decorations and displays. As part of the pomp and circumstance of the planned processions, the Society desired to carry the regimental flags of Ohio units in the reunion. That, however, required an act of the Ohio State Legislature. The state kept possession of the flags, weapons, and accoutrements of the war for the purpose of preservation. After petitioning the legislature, a resolution passed on April 12, 1878, authorizing the use by the Society of the battle flags, 2 artillery pieces, and 500 muskets and accessories for the infantry. On July 13th, the veterans of the county began gathering to practice their old infantry drills for the parade. The city of Newark prepared as well. Hotels and boarding houses expected a large influx of customers. The city was adorned in extensive decorations. Cords ran from buildings and high points around the square, leading to a large display on the newly built courthouse. Flags were tied to the lines of rope. Arches trimmed with evergreen branches dotted the square and lined the procession route. The names of fallen generals, Lytle, McCook, and especially McPherson, appeared in and around the square. The bridges along the procession path and the entrance to the Great Circle all received rich attention. Businesses and commercial blocks joined the communal effort, but the Society credited the women of Newark for their efforts in beautifying the city and the Great Circle for the occasion. We know so much about the preparation of the Great Reunion because the event had its own dedicated secretary and chronicler, Major Charles Dana Miller, former adjutant of the 76th and secretary of the Reunion Planning Committee. Miller enlisted as a private in the 76th at its formation in December 1861. Though of slight build and delicate health, Miller excelled at military life. He advanced quickly from private to adjutant captain and regimental record keeper, with his status of brevet major awarded for his service. Wounded twice and a company commander, Miller penned his own diary account of the war, leaving us with a first-hand account of the conflict. In 1879, Miller published his Report of the Great Reunion of the Veteran Soldiers and Sailors of Ohio. He discussed in the work's preface his purpose, scope, and perceived shortcomings.
In compiling the following report of the Great Reunion of the Soldiers and Sailors of Ohio, my aim has been to present in detail the whole proceedings, beginning with the time when the idea of holding a state reunion was first conceived, embracing the preliminary work, its progression, its consummation, and the general effects upon the public mind, and especially its revival of old war memories. In addition to the report proper, I trust the reader will find much statistical information valuable for present reference and of interest to posterity. Omissions are inevitable and brevity indispensable within the space herein allotted. Hence, I ask the reader's kind indulgence.
General Sherman would attend the reunion, as would Governor Richard Bishop of Ohio. President Rutherford B. Hayes returned an RSVP, elevating the guest list to the highest office in the land. One important figure would be lacking, however. Former President and leading Union General, Ulysses S. Grant, could not attend. But his letter of declination to Miller emphasized the importance of the undertaking. Grant was touring Europe at the time. His reply was dated in Milan, Italy, on April 27, 1878. With his regrets at being unable to attend, Grant alluded in the letter to the national sentiment to move on from the war. He reminded Major Miller of the accomplishments of the Union veterans and ended by saying,
I trust the veterans of Ohio will have a most auspicious reunion on the coming occasion, and that none of them will ever feel a disposition to apologize for the part they took in the late struggle for national existence, nor for the cause for which they fought.
Grant knew the mood of the country and the feelings of his former soldiers. National sentiment was moving against the post-war legacy of Reconstruction, but Grant wanted the veterans to know that they should be proud of what they had accomplished, even if they did not always receive the recognition they deserved. The attendees began arriving en masse on Saturday, July 20th, and continued through the weekend. The committee had tried to secure special rail rate fares for the event, but the railroad companies declined, believing that the event would not be highly attended. They were quite wrong. More than 1,000 people arrived in Newark by rail on the day preceding the reunion, which became a flood of 10,000 on the Monday morning before the event. Major Miller reported that thousands more came in from the surrounding countryside, nearly depopulating Licking County's many villages and farms. The streets of Newark were filled with carriages and wagons carrying excited reunion goers. People continued to arrive through the next morning, with many going straight to the Great Circle. Miller estimated the attendance at 31,000 people, a total corroborated by the newspaper accounts of the time. After a hot and uncomfortable July, nature had graced the society with what was called in the papers the perfect summer day. The morning of July 22nd was greeted by a warm sunrise and a salute from the 37 guns of the Cleveland Artillery Battery. All veterans were asked to gather at the Society headquarters between 9 and 10 a.m. and were presented with a special badge to mark their status. By 10 a.m., the square was filled with former soldiers. When President Hayes arrived, on a train running behind schedule, he was greeted by another 21-gun salute. The procession, commanded by Joseph Worley, began its march to the Great Circle at 11 o'clock. The reflexes of military life kicked in, despite the time that had passed, and the columns advanced from the square to the Great Circle in grand fashion. The cavalry led the way, followed by the military bands and the Ohio National Guard. The infantry veterans came next, and then the president and other dignitaries, with the tail of the procession concluding with Mexican War veterans, local officials, and the citizens of Licking County. 121 battle flags marched with them. Most were in such a tattered state that they could not be unfurled, but the soldiers carried them reverently nonetheless. As the infantry reached the entrance to the old fort, the band struck up John Brown's song, and the veterans all joined in singing one of the melodies that had led them into battle and raised their spirits. The columns marched in review in the Great Circle before the dignitaries and the speaker's platform set up over the Eagle Mound. So great was the press of people in the Great Circle that as the crowd thronged around the speaker's stand, the wooden structure gave way and collapsed. The honored dignitaries, including President Hayes and General Sherman, had to quickly abandon their seats to avoid the crumpling platform, averting a potential disaster. After an opening prayer at 1 p.m., speeches began with much praise being given to General McPherson, but also to the valor and sacrifice of the thousands that had gathered to remember him. General J. Warren Kiefer gave a detailed and, by all accounts, a very long speech. Governor Bishop, General Sherman, future President Garfield, and others followed with shorter orations. President Hayes gave a speech, yet it lacked any stirring calls. But General Willard Warner, a native of Granville and former lieutenant colonel in the 76th, gave a rousing opening address, praising the assembled veterans and reminding them of why they fought.
You have been called together to renew the friendship, to recall the memories, and to commemorate the achievement of the late great American War. And you are welcome because, at great loss to yourselves, you well served your country in the hour of her greatest danger. You were first good citizens, then good soldiers, then good citizens again, and you are ready, at your country's call, to be again good soldiers. Your self-sacrifice and your valor saved this fair region from the horrors of contending armies, and for this we owe you gratitude. You saved us from the calamity of a division of our country into two hostile and warring sections, with one ruled by an aristocracy and government founded on human slavery as a cornerstone. Yes, the plain truth should be spoken, now and always, and never forgotten. We were right, and our enemies were wrong, and therein, and more than in our success, was, is, and ever shall be our glory and their sorrow.
In total, there were 3 current or future presidents in attendance at the reunion: Hayes, Garfield, and a young William McKinley. Among the other notables in attendance was Old Abe, an aging bald eagle that had served as a mascot for the 8th Wisconsin Regiment through the war. Old Abe's participation was another item negotiated by the society, which arranged to pay for his travel from Wisconsin. The eagle was quite a crowd pleaser, and reports noted that the aging bird rivaled Hayes and Sherman in the adulation he received from the public. Despite the procession and formal speeches, once in the circle, the lines between companies and regiments, civilians and veterans broke down. As the speeches continued, the attendees meandered about the circle. Laid out under large shade trees, tables of food provided a welcome feast for the former soldiers after a long day of standing and marching. Food was provided free to all the participating veterans, gifted to them by the generous people of Licking County. Each township and city ward supplied tables of food for the hungry veterans. The participation by the county as a whole was another triumph of the planning committee. The veterans enjoyed the food provided by the local populace and sought out old comrades they might not have seen since the end of the war. After such strict protocols for the procession from Newark, the return at the conclusion of the festivities around 5 p.m. was casual and disorganized, as folks strolled back to the city. The exception were the National Guard units, which maintained their order until they completed the return march. Though the main event had concluded, the party wasn't finished. Parlors at the leading hotels of Newark were thrown open around 7 p.m., and President Hayes and the other dignitaries hosted receptions. The banquet at the Lansing House was the main event, and hosted by the president. Its menu featured a feast of options, including 2 varieties of tongue. The opportunity to greet so many eager potential voters was surely not lost upon the politicians, and more speeches and toasts were given as the evening progressed. Fireworks accompanied the eating and drinking with a flashy display on the west side of the square, and the streets thronged with people. Major Miller, ever the dutiful recorder of minutiae, listed each type of firework discharge and the quantity that was used. As the grand finale, the arch with McPherson's name produced jets of flame to grand acclaim. The reunion was a resounding success. The newspapers carried reports of the event, and all gave it great praise. Major Miller's recounting of the reunion was thorough and exhaustive. It included records from society meetings, correspondence, and even budget expenditures. Totaling more than 300 pages, the Major brought his talent for detail and literary organization to bear, leaving an extensive testament of the event. When the book was published in 1879, President Hayes would order multiple copies for himself. The businesses of Newark had profited greatly. The people of Licking County had found cause to celebrate. And the veterans, as Major Miller wrote towards the end of his account, reaped the glory they deserved. Again, historian Larry Stevens.
The Great Soldiers Reunion of 1878 was a tremendous success for Licking County. It pulled the community together, bonding with and honoring the Ohio soldiers of the American Civil War. It also played a part in the growth of future soldier fraternal organizations such as the Grand Army of the Republic and the lesser-known Union Veterans Legion. Ohio, at one time, had 900 Grand Army posts in operation. The Licking County veterans stepped up with GAR posts in Newark, Utica, Grayshot, Homer, Pataskala, Perryton, Johnstown, St. Louisville, and Jersey. These organizations continued with the charitable operations and furthering the political views of the veteran soldiers. Veteran reunions were very popular and were held well into the 20th century. Newark, Granville, and Johnstown hosted several large events, with Toboso hosting the annual Black Hand Soldiers and Sailors reunion that would draw thousands. In 1909, the statewide GAR meeting encampment was held in Newark. One could say that all of these later reunions, organizations, and events had a lineage back to the initial Great Statewide Soldiers and Sailors reunion of 1878 that was held in Newark.
Decoration Day celebrations would continue in Newark, as would soldier reunions. But none ever rivaled the scale and scope of the Great Reunion of 1878. The former soldiers' struggles for recognition and reintegration with their communities would continue. Yet the Society of Soldiers and Sailors and the people of Licking County had given a suitable show of gratitude to Ohio's veteran.